physical relations. We come from a family, there's a father, there's a mother, and then there are friends, family, spouse. You are meant to be the evolved souls, you are meant to be the yogis. Then how can you not see that beyond this physical mold and see the true me? So there is this knowledge practice or knowledge will gap or a knowledge will gulf. Suffering in a way is a kind of a dissatisfaction. I want something but I'm not able to get it, an unfulfilled desire. This is a series on Sri Aurobindo's book, Synthesis of Yoga. And today's talk is an exploration of chapter 23 in the section in this book on Yoga of Integral Knowledge or Jnana Yoga. The chapter is called The Conditions of Attainment to the Gnosis. Gnosis or the supramental plane, Sri Aurobindo describes through this chapter as that plane from which the suffering and the sins of the mankind come to an end. Yet at the same time, it is that space from where an effective, perfect action can unfold. So it brings an end to the suffering and the sins, the basis of both being the desires and the struggles that we go through, identified with this one physical mold. And when one is possessed or one attains to this highest plane or the plane of Gnosis, there is an end to this suffering or groping or struggle towards fulfilling oneself, and in process of seeking one's own personal gains, some unkind acts towards oneself and others, which one may refer to as sins. This comes to an end. And the name of the chapter, The Conditions of the Attainment to the Gnosis, he uses the word conditions because certain conditions need to be met or fulfilled much before one can even align oneself with the Gnosis, let alone merge into the Gnosis. So there are certain conditions need to be fulfilled, which this chapter is about. And second, he uses the word, the conditions of attainment to the Gnosis, versus using the word achievement of the Gnosis. Very often one tries to achieve things which has an egoistic connotation to it, whereas attainment is a kind of merging into something greater. And here the individuality and egoism is in a way lost, and one merges into a much higher and greater space, which is the Gnosis. So that's the exploration of today. And just to set the context on, in terms of the Panchakosha or the 7 layers, what really one refers to when one uses the word Gnosis or supramental plane. Sri Aurobindo and all the ancient texts broadly classify the planes of existence or of consciousness into 7 planes, the highest being the Sat, and then the Chit or the consciousness force, and then Ananda emerging out of the Sat and Chit, being the first, second and third layer, and then supramental or the Gnosis or the Vijnanamaya plane as the fourth, which is the bridge between these higher three layers and the lower three layers, which are the mind and the vital and the physical. Usually our life pans out at these lower three planes, mental, vital and physical. The dominant principle at the physical being actually being able to see things, hold things. And there is a very clear separation, habitual nature at the level of physical. The dominant principle at the level of vital being desires, and these desires can be more gross to more subtle. And then the dominant principle at the level of mind is the power of thought and the intellect, and this mind itself can have further varying levels of illumination, some which are diving deep into the vital and the physical and the grosser desires, to higher, more and more illumined layers, closer and closer to the Gnosis and the supramental plane. And in the previous chapter, called as the Vijnana or Gnosis, Sri Aurobindo enlightens us with a description and understanding of the Gnosis plane, yet at the same time sharing that it is not something that can be understood or can be truly understood or truly described. And we use the analogy of trying to understand Gnosis as like a monkey trying to understand the human mind. But the description and understanding serves a purpose of fueling our aspiration towards evolution, towards the supramental. And it also helps to dispel the misbeliefs around what Gnosis is not. And in the summary of that chapter, Sri Aurobindo contrasted Gnosis with the mental plane in three key ways. The first being that at the level of mind, and in fact at the level of the lower three layers, where the key principle is separation and everything has a name and form, at the level of these lower three layers, specifically at the level of mind, there is an effort in seeking for knowledge. One tries to hold on to an object or study a subject, understand it, reflect on it, and then gains a certain knowledge about it. Whereas at the level of Gnosis, the effort is not there. There is a spontaneous inherent knowledge of the subject. The second key feature is that at the level of mind, things are understood by breaking things down. Whereas, for example, the time is seen, if we are planning things, then we are trying to see in terms of past, present and future. Whereas at the level of Gnosis, things are first seen in its totality, and through that the inner and outer phenomena is understood. So the time is seen as a continuum of past, present and future as a total, and from there things come. And thirdly, at the level of mind, there is a certain dilution when a bright idea emerges in the mind, but when it goes into execution at the level of vital and physical, a dilution happens, modification happens. It doesn't remain the same bright idea when it comes into execution for all of us. But at the level of supramental, the idea itself carries within it a perfect self-effectiveness. So the idea is perfectly brought into manifestation, fulfilling itself. So these are the three key points through which Sri Aurobindo contrasted the mind, or the level, or even if it's the highest levels of the mind, with the supramental or the Gnosis. And this chapter is about the conditions of attainment to this Gnosis. So when we begin our journey through this chapter, we start first at the level of where we stand today in our usual state of consciousness in the context of the 7 layers or the 5 layers of the existence. The 5 layers which are more accessible to human beings: the physical, vital, mental, supramental, and the Anandamaya. So usually the man is meant to be a mental being, where the dominant principle is the intellect and the thought, and it has an inherent capacity of inner senses, and these inner senses can perceive the thoughts and emotions within one's own being, and the thoughts and thought forms and emotions and phenomena outside oneself, and how all of these relate to each other. It can perceive also what is panning out at a vital and at a physical level, but its perception of the vital and physical is that of a more inert thing. For example, the mind cannot perceive that this object has a certain divinity in it. For it, that potential of that object is that at best it can lie there, and it cannot move. Whereas from the higher perception, there can be a tangible consciousness which can be perceived, even in the matter, even in the vital. So this is one limitation that the mind has in human beings being a mental being. The second limitation emerges because this mind is encased in a physical mold. It is there in a body, and so this mind gets conditioned by the matter. It gets conditioned by the outer senses. So the mind has its own inner senses, but then when it adopts a body, then it has its outer senses. And this is where the process of seeking pleasure and evading pain starts. And one wants to see the most beautiful things, smell the most beautiful things, and one wants to hear the beautiful rhythms and wants to evade any kind of pain. And in process, the mind then turns into a monkey mind, jumping from one place to the other. And add to that the strong attachments that we develop when we have those physical relations. We come from a family, there's a father, there's a mother, and then there are friends, family, spouse. And the person's preoccupation turns to dealing with the pleasures and securing satisfaction, security, and pleasures for oneself and those one is attached to, and becomes completely oblivious even of the best possible capacities of the mind and the inner mind senses, let alone the Gnosis and the higher planes. And this was quite beautifully signified in the story of the Rishi Ashtavakra, who, when he came into the kingdom of Raja Janak and his court, and Raja Janak himself being an evolved yogi had a lot of people in his court who were evolved and yogis, yet at the same time when they saw Ashtavakra Rishi with his disfigured body with multiple folds in it, they started laughing at him. And Rishi Ashtavakra asked the question that you are meant to be the evolved souls, you are meant to be the yogis, then how can you not see that beyond this physical mold and see the true me, which is which is a divine presence. And that brings us to the context that even in the spirituality or for a sadhak, because the mind is constantly being conditioned by the physical and the senses, one comes back and forgets and usually sees what the senses present as a picture and forget to see that divine presence. So that is the limitation in our usual state of consciousness, where the mind is conditioned by matter. And this Sri Aurobindo describes as man in his principle, a mental being, but not one living in a mind world. So when the mind is not encased by matter, the mind with its inner senses has a capacity of living at a much more peaceful sattvic level of the mind. But man in his principle, a mental being, but not living in a mind world, but in a dominantly physical existence. His is a mind cased in matter and conditioned by matter. So this brings the limitations in our current scenario. But at the level of Gnosis, everything changes. And the dominant principle there is an inherent knowledge and an effective action, seeing things in totality. And Sri Aurobindo describes the Gnosis through these few beautiful words, and he says, it is the center and the circumference of the truth vision of things. So he uses the word center and the circumference of the truth vision of things. And these words bring a certain clarity along with it. And the clarity is that in the Gnosis plane, the unity and multiplicity take a different meaning. At the level of the mind, unity and multiplicity have a meaning. For example, we have a puzzle. Then multiplicity is there are different pieces of the puzzle, and unity is when those pieces come together, then they are seen as one and united. And so life also is seen as we are all different beings. Earth is different, plants are different, animals are different, and the whole universe is made of different things. And then when we all come together, we unite together, we come together in a physical contact or in an idea, then we become united. Whereas at the level of Gnosis, the unity is the starting point, and from unity originates multiplicity. And one can understand this with an analogy of Ganga flowing from the Himalayas. That from the Himalayas, Ganga flows into very different streams, and yet at the same time, it is always connected and not separated from the Himalayas. So all the streams from the unity of Himalayas, the multiplicity of the streams of Ganga is originating. And then the second aspect is that unity is present in the multiplicity. So the unity is the origin of multiplicity, and then unity is also present in the multiplicity. So the water that is flowing through Ganga and very different streams carries the same essence, which is the snow from which it's melting and flowing into Ganga. And then it carries within an indefeasible oneness, is the word that Sri Aurobindo uses, that it's something which cannot be divided. So this whole complex of the Himalayas and the streams of Ganga, they are all one complex. They cannot be divided in any way. So that is the nature of the Gnosis plane, where actually it's not a unity of the puzzle pieces which are actually separate, but it is actually a unity first and multiplicity second, and even in its multiplicity, it is connected and unseparated, and within the multiplicity, it carries the unity. Now, this is something which kind of takes our mind through a toss, but this is something which needs to be, this paradigm needs to be comprehended if one is to actually align oneself to the Gnosis plane. One needs to be able to experience, and one simple way of experiencing this is to expand the mind. This is pretty much a practical, tangible experience through the mind that we can all have, which is to expand the mind beyond our physical body, embracing the whole earth, the galaxy, and the whole universe, and identifying oneself with the universal cosmic existence. And then to see within this universal cosmic existence all the little existences and forms sprouting out of that universal cosmic existence. Maybe we can close our eyes for a moment so that we can align to this experience, which will make this whole talk more meaningful then. Maybe we can take a few deep breaths. And visualize a flower in the center of the heart, and breathe through this flower for a moment. And bring close to us whichever divine form we feel close to or we adore, and feeling the love and closeness and intimacy of that divine form, letting that joy and love expand to every cell of the body, to the entire earth, to the entire solar system, to the entire galaxy, and this ever-expanding universe. And affirming to oneself that maybe I am not this mind and body, I am this universal existence, and seeing all these little forms in this universe arising out of this universe, this all universe being present within every form, the all in allness. And feel that from this point, the rhythm of the breath shifts. It's easier to get out of one's own physical mold and look up beyond this universe to a greater possibility of Gnosis. And this alignment is necessary for us to have any further conversation on what is Gnosis, what are the conditions to be attained for Gnosis. Because if we are still identified, now we can contrast and come back and see how we feel when we feel like this physical body, versus identifying with this unity of the universal cosmos and seeing the multiplicity originating out of it. There is a contrasting there in that universal experience. There is a lot more alignment. But when we identify the physical mold and then we talk about Gnosis, it's like standing in the busy streets of Chandni Chowk and asking ke Himalaya ka rasta bata do. So the step one for us is to get to the foothills of Himalaya, which is this universal cosmic existence experience, and seeing every form carrying or originating from this universal cosmos, sprouting from that cosmos. And this Sri Aurobindo describes in his words through these lines: a secure universality of being is the very basis of this luminous higher consciousness. Abandoning all rigid separateness, we have to feel ourselves one with all things and beings, to identify ourselves with them, to become aware of them as ourselves, to feel their being as our own, to admit their consciousness as part of ours, to contact their energy as intimate to our energy, to learn how to be one self with all. That oneness is not indeed all that is needed, but it is a first condition, and without it there is no Gnosis. So he says that this secure universality of the being, and then taking away all the rigid separateness, and then having that fluidity or capacity for an exchange, to feel one with every being in this universe, with the universal being, with every little form, with every little particle, is a very basic foundation to arrive at the foothill of the Himalayas. He says that that oneness is not indeed all that is needed. So it is just a first step, but it is a first condition, and without it there is no Gnosis. Without it we are more like in Chandni Chowk and thinking about Himalayas. So once we have moved from the trap or being conditioned by the mind is conditioned by matter, from that space one has purified the being, and then one has had this universal experience from which there is more alignment to the Gnosis. The next step is that this experience can be very fleeting. Sri Aurobindo talks about a secure universality of the being. So this experience can be fleeting, and one can again come back into the conditioning of the physical matter. If one sees and one is still operating out of the body, if the soul is seated in the body, if the thoughts are arising out of the mental lotus and the emotions are still arising out of the heart lotus, then this experience would continue to be only fleeting. It cannot be a secure experience. So eventually there has to be a possibility where the consciousness moves out of the center of the consciousness, moves out of the body, and it may move behind the body, or more importantly above the body, and it is kind of an enveloping experience. And this is where the sages describe that it is not the body which is carrying the soul, but it is the soul which is carrying the body. And I'm sure many of you might have seen those figures of Panchakosha, where they are shown in two different ways. And usually to the mind that can be confusing, that the 5 layers of the koshas are shown as Annamaya kosha as the outermost, then the Pranamaya kosha inner to that, then the Manomaya further inner, and then the Vijnanamaya, and the Anandamaya is shown as a central or essential thing. whereas there is another description simultaneous to it where the Annamaya Kosha is the innermost and Pranamaya outer, mental further, then supramental, and the Anandamaya or the soul aspect is the outermost. So both these possibilities exist, and if one has to secure this universality, then it is the center of consciousness staying out of the body and enveloping the body. Enveloping brings that intimacy. So one doesn't become aloof from the body, one still stays intimate, and yet at the same time one is out of the body. So this is something which can bring that security in the universal experience of the being. Now, the challenge with this holding this center of consciousness and outside the body is very often it can also bring a certain aloofness. So it is important that one embraces, and it is not that the thoughts and emotions are all happening outside the body. Thoughts and emotions can still be experienced in the brain and in the heart, but their origin lies above in a higher center of consciousness. And this helps bring us to the paradigm where the infinite aspect of the being becomes the primal and the finite aspect of the being becomes a secondary. So in this state of consciousness, if the action is to unfold, then the action will unfold from the universality. One is identified with the universal cosmic existence, and whenever it is required for some act to be done, then temporarily, transiently, to varying degree, a certain individuality comes in for that action, only to again disappear. So our resting state shifts. Usually when we do work and then we come back to rest, then we are within us and we are in our own self-centered space. But here, when the consciousness comes to rest, then it merges with the universal self-existence, fluid and supple. Now the state of a center above the body is something which is very difficult to comprehend, almost impossible to comprehend for an intellectual person. Intellectual Aurobindo describes as a spider trapped in his own web. So for a person trapped in his own belief systems, thoughts and views, to envision a center above from where the whole being can operate is something which is almost seemingly impossible. But once such an experience appears and unfolds for a person by the blessing of the divine, then it is a self-verifying experience, because it brings a certain lightness to the being. It brings a certain calmness in the whole being. It makes the action more effective, so to say. So this experience itself verifies the possibility of operating this body, yet the center of consciousness being above this body. And then Sri Aurobindo talks about that how this, he re-emphasizes that how this infinite becomes the primal consciousness and this finite becomes the secondary consciousness. And as long as for us this finite or the physical is the primal consciousness and infinite is sometimes a fleeting experience, then Gnosis is still very far away. So the infinite has to become the primal and an all-pervading experience for us. So we've looked at the step 1, we've looked at the step 2. The step 1 is to move out of the body and expand the mind and look at an identity with the universal cosmic existence. The step 2 is to secure this experience by moving the center of consciousness, the origin of thoughts, emotions and acts, to somewhere above the body. The third step is to see the double aspect of infinite. So one infinity, one is talking about the all-pervasive, all-extending. The universe is always expanding. So that aspect of the infinite. But there is also an inner infinite, a sukshma infinite, the infinite seated within every particle. That's the sukshma infinite. And that sukshma infinite, along with the all-pervasive infinite, becomes a pathway for one's highest self, which is the Satchidananda, which is the very source of both these infinite. One is the all-pervading infinite, and second is the sukshma infinite. Within the body also there is the Sushumna Nadi. There is the Ida and Pingala, from where the yin and yang, or the feminine and masculine, is manifesting. And then there is the very central, the essential sukshma infinite, which is the Sushumna Nadi. So when one opens up to both the aspects of the infinite, the sukshma and the all-pervading, it leads one to the pathway of transcendence of both, to the very source, which is the Satchidananda, which has the capacity to possess all the lower layers and transform them into the image of divine. So when we are talking about the step 1 and step 2, they are panning out more at the level of the mind. And the mind expands, mind adopts a center beyond its consciousness, beyond the body, but still it doesn't have the full capacity to transform the vital or take a possession of the vital or the physical. But this transcendent supreme, which is the source of this double infinite, has the capacity to transform each and every layer of the being, the vital. It can take possession of the subconscious, the unconscious, and transform it. So these become the first 3 steps of the conditions of attainment of Gnosis. The first, to expand and identify with the all-pervasive cosmic infinite, and to see the unity and multiplicity arising out of this unity. The second step is to adopt a center of consciousness which is above the body. The third, to transcend to the source of the all-pervading infinite and the sukshma infinite, into the very source which can take possession of all the layers. But there is the next 4th step, which fully integrates the first 3 steps, which becomes fully dynamic. The Gnosis plane itself is fully dynamic, but through this body it is not fully dynamic, because the consciousness of body is still the same. The senses are still seeking pleasure, the vital is still going after desires, the body is still in its own fixed rhythms. So, and the knowledge and will have their own gap in the human beings. The one thinks about something and then one plans and then one acts, and sometimes one thinks, but there is an endless sea of procrastination these days, so one thinks but one doesn't act. Or sometimes we can jump to an action, there is will, but there is no thought behind it, the thought follows later. So there is a gap between knowledge and the will, they're separated. Whereas at the level of Gnosis, the knowledge and will are two sides of the same coin. So the substance of consciousness also needs to be transformed and turned into the image of divine if the full flow or full force of the dynamic effectiveness is to happen through the individual mold or the instrument. It's like one has plugged in to the supreme charger, but if the wire is carrying too much resistance, then even if you're plugged in, the wire will get burnt very quickly, and one may very quickly find oneself in a psychiatric hospital because one may not be able to bear the ecstasy or the intensity of the energy that flows from that supreme charger. So the resistance of the wire needs to be transformed at every level, and the transformation in the senses, both the Jnanendriya and the Karmendriya, and the Jnanendriya unfolding and flowering. So each of these instruments have their own highest possibility which flowers over a period of time. The senses carry within them the capacity to perceive the inside and outside of every phenomena by just coming in a subtle contact or holding it in one's attention. So there can be that possibility when the inner senses flower, and this is described in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra as one of the siddhis, samayama. But when it comes to the Gnosis, transforming the senses, flowering the senses, it's one of the natural possibilities which emerges. Usually one ends up pursuing such siddhis, but from the Gnosis plane, this is a natural outflowering. And so this happens at the level of senses. And when the Gnosis plane takes a possession of the will, then the will transforms. The will has two challenges. One we just discussed, which is the knowledge-action gap, which is that we can have all the bright ideas, but the will and the knowledge are separated. Are they coming into action? We can hear all this and I can speak all this and then go back home and do very differently, including myself. So there is this knowledge practice or knowledge will gap or a knowledge will gulf at times, which can be bridged by the Gnosis. The second challenge for the will is the challenge of the struggle between the individual will and the universal will. I want to do something else, the other person wants to do something else, and we all want to stamp our authority, and the universe is stamping its own authority. So all the different wills are in a struggle. But at the level of Gnosis, these wills merge into one idea. And out of this one idea, the other side of the coin is the divine will. When it emerges out, then the universal will and the individual will is in harmony to each other. It also transforms our emotions, love, hatred, joy, each and every emotion into a play of the universal delight and the universal love, and eventually brings an end to the suffering and the sins. Suffering and sin, the basis of it being the desire, which are panning out through our emotions and through our lower being. If we see the suffering in a way is a kind of a dissatisfaction, I want something, but I'm not able to get it, an unfulfilled desire. And a sin is, in order to satisfy my own personal gain, I do something which is unkind, sometimes to myself or another part of oneself and to others. So the basis is desire, and desire in a way is there as a basis of the desire is incapacity and ignorance. That I am this physical body with this limited power and I want this, but this thing is very far from me, or many other people want the same thing and there is a struggle to get to it. It's like being in a marriage and being on the chaat or Golgappa counter where, everybody wants that chaat and there is a struggle around it. So the desires are always struggling. And this incapacity is further, the basis of it is ignorance, wherein we forget that we are this universal cosmic existence. We forget this possibility of the Gnosis part of, or the highest self of us. And we identify fully with this mold. And that is the basis of all suffering and sin. Ignorance giving rise to incapacity, that giving rise to that something is outside me and I need to have it. Whereas when one identifies with the universal cosmic existence, then I'm the whole. Then one is not reaching out for things. So this becomes the very basis for the whole suffering and sin. And this, the Gnosis plane, transforms at a sensory level, at a will level, at an emotional level, and also at a level of the subconscious. Because we may consciously tell ourselves, we may consciously expand to this universal cosmic existence identification, but the subconscious, in the subconscious, this sense of physical identity is very deep-seated. And the Gnosis plane has the capacity to transform this identity and even take hold of our lowermost impulses, perversions, instincts, and uplift them into not trying to possess things, but trying to possess the divine ananda or divine delight in things. And that it does not by lecturing those things or lecturing those instincts and impulses, because lecturing can suppress it, but it cannot transform it. But it uplifts those impulses and instincts to that ecstasy and transforms them so that they naturally return to their original samskara, which is within the subconscious also. There is the original samskara of seeking to possess the divine delight in things and not just the object. And that completes the fourth step, which is the aspiration for all of us, the conditions of attainment of Gnosis. And it brings a perfection in the knowledge power, in the will power, and in the delight power. And each of these powers are a source of many different siddhis or occult powers which are being pursued by a lot of people in this world. But from the Gnosis plane, they are a natural opening, a natural outflowering. And even in this process, what is transformed is our sense of I. Where does our sense of I go in all this? Usually the sense of I is, I do this, I feel this, I think this. To somebody who has opened up to the presence of divine within, and one consecrates to that divine within, and one says that I act as per what is the divine will guiding me within me, but still In that consecrated space, it is the I which is acting. But here, one is seated above and identified with the cosmic existence, possessed by the Gnosis plane, and witnessing the unfolding of the action in this transformed instrument. So, the language of that Jivatman would be, Aurobindo uses these words, God himself by his Prakriti knows, acts, loves, takes delight through my individuality and its figures, and fulfills there in its higher and divine measures the multiple Leela which the infinite forever plays in the universality which is himself forever. So Jivatman seated here says God himself, which is the supreme, by his Prakriti, Prakriti is the forces of the universe. So the God acts through the Prakriti, and God knows and acts and loves and takes delight through my individuality, through this transient individuality and its figures, and fulfills there in its higher and divine measures. So it has its own higher and divine measures and multiple Leelas which the infinite forever plays in the universe, which is himself forever. So just to summarize, we started with our usual state of the being, which is we are a mental being, human beings, with limitations, being encased in the physical body, conditioned by the physical body. And initially, we are so preoccupied that we have no inclination to even come to a satsang. But then when we purify to some degree from this physical identity and open up to our own inherent capacity of inner mind sense, then an aspiration for Gnosis arises. And that takes us to the step 1 in this chapter, which is first to expand to the universal cosmic existence identity, soften that separateness from others. Then step 2, adopting a space above as the main center of consciousness or origin of thoughts and emotions. Third, to seek to be possessed by the very source of this all-pervading infinite and the Sukshma infinite, the transcendent being. And fourth, for all these layers to be possessed and transformed so that the charger is plugged in and the wire has the least possible resistance for a dynamic action to unfold.